mess that I had made of them 10 minutes before I spoke last time. So hopefully I got them a little bit more together now. I know it's only been a week, but things are going well at camp. We had our young teen week last week. It was a smaller week than most of them are, or most of them have been thus far, but it's still good nonetheless. You'll probably keep hearing his name because, like I said, the Lord's provision is funny, and in some ways it's been humbling. There was a long time ago, I remember very distinctly remember sitting in my boss's office and talking about staffing and future hiring and who that would be and what that would look like. And he asked me about, like, how do you feel about having like older people that are retired working with you? And I kind of balked at the idea because I'm like, I don't see how that's really going to be a good fit for the kind of work that we have to do to bring people in that are like trying to retire from the workforce. And I have been proven wrong time and time again with our new hire, Pat. The guy has been an absolute gem to have around. And last week Travis was on vacation and I had a bunch of young people and none of them could drive, so they can't drive the trucks around camp. So they're kind of like hamstrung in what they can do. Becomes kind of interesting, like, hey, I need you to go do this, and you're like, oh, wait, you can't just go do that, because if you do, it's going to take you like 15 minutes to walk there and then 15 minutes to walk back, carrying everything you need. But Pat very happily chauffeured them around and got them going on the jobs they were doing, made sure they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, meanwhile doing the things he was supposed to be doing. It's been great. So I have learned that age, in many ways, is just a number, and that God really has a use for people that are retired and they feel like they can't do stuff. It is amazing how much you can actually contribute to ministries with a willing heart. And I am very blessed and fortunate to have him working for us, and I'm sure you'll keep hearing that. I mean, I like everybody that I'm working with. Travis is a great guy as well, but I've just been, like I said, sort of humbled and surprised by Pat Dillon, the guy that's working with us now. Every day I'm just kind of like, I don't know why I was so reluctant to have people that have so much experience. Yes, maybe he can't keep up with the 18-year-old wee wacky, but he can do so many other things. So anyways, I'm very grateful for him. So just continue to pray for him and his wife. It's kind of cool that his wife works with the horses and he's working with me, and his granddaughter's counseling. Like, they just kind of moved in and have been taking on a burden that camp had and doing it well. So with that, I'd like to get back into Judges. So I stopped last week towards the end of Judges 3. So we're going to kind of finish off chapter 3, and then we're going to go through chapter 4. And in much the same way as last week, there's some of the things that as I was reading through it, that I found were particularly interesting to me, or I guess thoughts that got stirred up in my head as we're going through this sort of historical part of the Bible. Like, it's just a historical account of things that happened. I think a lot of the spiritual lessons and the things that come out of chapter 4, Dan will actually cover next week. If I'm honest, I read through the Song of Deborah, and I was glad I didn't have that chapter, because it seems harder than this one. It's easier to go through facts than some of the things that she talks about. She's like reiterating facts and stuff, but some of it are a little abstract, and I was like, these would take some time to study out. So pray for Dan as he prepares for next week. So I guess I'd just like to give a quick recap of some of the things that we went through last week and some of the lessons that I talked about last week. The ones that I have written down here is that history forgotten was history repeated. The nation of Israel would do well, and then they would fall, and then they would do well, and they would fall. Each time they forgot the failings that came before and the punishments that came before. I remember last week I asked the question, do we follow God because he is good or because he is God? And how the people that were being called to obedience in God had not experienced his blessings, and they chose to not follow after, and then after a while they realized that going the opposite way was much harder than following after God, and they came around to it. And then the next part, one of the things we talked about in the beginning of the last chapter, was the testing part. Like, God left some of the people in the nation or in the land to test them and to challenge them, to teach them more, and the value of those testings and doing hard things, not so that we can prove ourselves to ourselves, but so that God has opportunity to prove himself to us. And I remember, if you don't remember, the conclusion that we concluded on was recognizing that, well, the nation of Israel had a tremendous history of failing and then coming back to God, and it's easy to look at them and be like, how could you be so foolish? Just remembering that we are not above their failings as well, and to be cautious and also, I guess, empathetic and compassionate to their weakness, and recognizing that really what comes out of this and what we should be pointing back to is not the faithfulness or lack thereof of the people, but being reminded of the faithfulness of God, which we talked about briefly this morning in the first meeting, and we'll also be revisiting as well. So, with that, I'd like to read from verse 27 in chapter 3, and then we'll read all the way through Judges 4, and we'll go back through it again and talk about some of the things that, again, that I found challenging or interesting or beneficial. So starting in verse 27, it says, "It came about when he had arrived that he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was in front of them. He said to them, 'Pursue them, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands.' So they went down after him, and they seized the fords of the Jordan opposite the Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross. They struck down at that time 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued the day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. After him came Shamgar the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel." In chapter 4 it says, "Then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Hasaroth Hagoyim. The sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. Now Deborah the prophetess, a wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramoth and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came to her for judgment. Now she sent and summoned Barak the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, 'Behold, the Lord God of Israel has commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishron, and I will give him into your hand.' Then Barak said to her, 'If you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go.' And she said, 'I will surely go with you, nevertheless the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman.' Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Canaanite had separated himself from the Canaanites, from the sons of Hoab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent far away as the oak of Zanaim, which is near Kadesh. Then they told Sisera that Barak the son of Abinadab had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him from Haroish Hagoyim to the river Kishron. Deborah said to Barak, 'Arise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you.' So Barak went down from the Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all of his army with the edge of the sword before Barak, and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Heshroth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not even one was left. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, for there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Canaanite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, 'Turn aside, my master, turn aside to me, do not be afraid.' And he turned aside to her into her tent, and she covered him with the rug. He said to her, 'Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty.' So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. And then she covered him, and he said to her, 'Stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be that if anyone comes and inquires of you, and says, Is there anyone here? that you shall say no.' But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand, and went secretly to him, and drove the peg into his temple, and it went through into the ground. For he was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. And behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, 'Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking.' And he entered with her, and behold, Sisera was lying dead with a tent peg in his temple. So God subdued on that day Jabin the king of Canaan before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan." So, that's a very uplifting and encouraging story, nonetheless. I look forward to actually getting to it. There's some interesting points that we're going to talk about in that last one, stories, and it's just bizarre. Anyways, so if you kind of remember what had happened before verse 27 in chapter 3, you had Eglon, the king, was suppressing Israel. Ehud rises up, he kills the king, and you can only imagine after they found out the king was dead, there is a sort of this turmoil, I'm sure, that was going on. Like, the leader is dead. Imagine what happens when a president gets assassinated in a country. Like, the whole country is like, who did this? What's going on here? There's politics involved, there's order involved, there's legalities involved. It can be a real mess. What's more than that is that at this time period in the Near East, we'll say, the kings represented the gods. So if you had a king be victorious over another king, it wasn't that they were just subduing the king. It was this person's god subduing this person's god. So now there's a religious crisis as well that is potentially starting to brew here now that Ehud had killed the king Eglon. But as this pandemonium begins, Ehud takes opportunity to use this to continue to rout the nation. So they're obviously at this point, they're trying to figure out who killed the king, and they're pursuing him. And it starts in verse 27, as he flees, and he arrives in this place, and he blew his trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down to him from the hill country, and he was in front of them. He said, "Pursue them, for the Lord has given the enemy, the Moabites, into your hands." What's interesting to me when I was reading this is that you have Ehud declaring not some new truth. You can read in the book of Joshua, and the promises even before that, of the victory that was promised of taking the land. But at this point, the nation had done sinful things. They were kind of sitting back on their haunches. They were being persecuted by Eglon, and Ehud decides that enough is enough. What I found interesting to me was there was no formal call. There was nothing it just says that Ehud, a left-handed swordsman, made this decision. I don't know if it was by himself. Obviously, I'm sure the Lord was leading in it, but it doesn't necessarily say that in the text. And he decided to do something about it. He decided to take hold of the truth that we have victory, and he was one that decided to start that going. But one of the things that I know we've mentioned it, I mentioned in the intro, and I also mentioned it last week, was that history forgotten is history repeated. But also, conversely, I think there's a truth in that history remembered. I had it written down in a way. Let's see where it was. It was history forgotten is history repeated, but also history remembered is history experienced. In a sense that the people that were being called to battle right now, they had been under oppression for 18 years. And after Othniel had died, but Ehud is reminding them of the truths and the promises of God that we should do something. We have the opportunity for victory. Let's claim it. This is not necessarily a spiritual application so much as just something that I'm going to point out because I think it's valuable to recognize in ourselves. This is kind of steering outside the Bible for just a second, but I think it makes us good citizens, and it also, in such, makes us better able to love strangers. And what happens here with Ehud is he is deciding to do something. He's deciding to take action and then calling others to do the same thing. I don't know if you've ever been through any sort of crisis training, but there's a really interesting psychological effect that happens. It's called the bystander effect. And what the bystander effect is, it's actually a fairly well-studied phenomenon in that when there's a crisis amongst a group of people, so say somebody has a medical emergency and there's a bunch of people there, everybody assumes that somebody else is going to do something. And then oftentimes it's happened where people have done nothing, even though there was more than enough people that were able to do it, but everybody just assumes that somebody else is going to do something. And the way to overcome that, and I guess as an encouragement to all of you, is to be aware of that. That is a part of our failings as humans. And if you look at some of the case studies they've done on this phenomenon, just in I don't want to say in the media, but just in history, it's actually quite disturbing. terrible things happen and nobody does anything. And I guess the encouragement to you as good citizens and lovers of people, that next time, if you're ever in a situation where there's something going on that's bad, recognizing yourself that you already are like predisposed to not doing something, and if you ever have the thought in your mind, somebody should do something, the next thought should be, could I be that someone? And then act on it. Because you have opportunities where, say you have no medical training and somebody collapses and everybody assumes something's going to do something. You might not have any medical training, but you can go over there and like poke the person, and who knows, there might be somebody in the crowd that does have medical training that is suffering from the bystander effect, that sees you doing something like, I guess I should help. And then all of a sudden the group goes from doing nothing to being helpful. And that is sort of what you see, like Ehud is running down the hill and he's saying, pursue them. Like they can see what's going on. Like I'm sure they all saw what was going on. These people are all running past in confusion. But he made the difference of declaring, let's act. And then when he declared, let's act, people followed him. And they ended up routing the enemy. So I guess as a practical application, as I was reading through this and seeing this, is just being mindful of that in yourself. There's it's a psychological, well-studied propensity to do nothing when we're in a group of people. It's kind of like if you see a car broke down on the side of the road, you just assume somebody else is going to stop. Well, somebody could be you. Maybe I should do that. So I know I suffer from that at times, but be aware of it and use it to be opportunities to help people, to show the love of God by being the first to act. So, the next part, the next verse, it says, so they went down after him, and they seized the fords of the Jordan opposite of Moab, and did not allow anybody to cross. As I was thinking about that, like, wait a minute. This was not only, Ehud created this situation, but then there was some brilliant military strategy that went on. We don't think of like fords and rivers as kind of a foreign concept, I guess, in America, because there's not places where we decide to cross rivers, where we can ford a river, meaning like the water is shallow enough that you can walk through it. I can't tell you the last time I drove my car through a creek. I go over bridges, so I don't have to drive through the water. But the Jordan being a large river that flows, there's only certain points where you can actually cross it without swimming. So you have these armies that are fleeing and also trying to get reinforcements, and knowing that they're probably of an inferior force, they decide, capture the fords, and then in a sense, the enemy has to come at you from only this direction. You don't, if you can control the ford and you can fight the battle on one front, you know they're not going to be circling around you behind you because they can't do it. You know there's going to be no reinforcements coming because they all have to get through the same funnel. So there's a brilliant piece of military strategy that goes on here that allows them to also be successful. And obviously you can see Ehud's being led and doing the work of a judge and called by God, but sometimes it's interesting to see that God could have done something miraculous in a sense. He could have just struck the whole army, but instead he did things in a logical and concise way that allowed them to have victory. And I think that's interesting to see God use not just miracles, but also wisdom to solve problems. And then as it goes on into verse 29, it says, they struck down at that time 10,000 Moabites, all robust, valiant men, and no one escaped. I was looking at this concept of battle, and one of the things that they pointed out in some of the study Bibles is how rare this actually was. Like, if we looked at this battle in modern terms, you would probably not call it a battle. You'd call it something else. We'd call it a massacre. Like when you have two forces of varying size and one force just completely destroys the other one, that's a massacre. And as odd as it sounds in war, it's almost kind of like the frowned upon thing. Like you gave no quarter to the enemy. They just completely wiped them out. And this actually was not something that was actually that common in battles in the Near East as it was in that day. But as I was thinking about what he says as he's running down the hill, it says, I want to read it exactly what it says here. lost the verse. It says, God has given them into your hands. When I was thinking about that idea of God has given them into your hands, it made me think about the gospel. When God set out to save man, he didn't bring them 99% of the way. He didn't bring them 99.9% of the way. He did it all the way. And when you think about the words, the dying words of Christ on the cross, it wasn't, it's almost done. You finish it. It is finished. When God gave them victory over the Moabites, it wasn't partial victory. It was total victory. It was finished. When he said he gave them into your hands, he gave them all into his hands. And when we think about Christ's death for sin, it wasn't some of them, it was all of them. We are completely justified, not almost justified. And you'll see that again. This happens again in the battle that goes on in the next chapter. But just being reminded of the totality of when God sets out to do something, he doesn't do it part way. When he said he was going to destroy the earth by flood, it was full. I forget how many cubits above the highest mountain. It was full. It was done. Wiped out everything. So again, coming back to that concept of the faithfulness of God. The next verse, it says, so Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land of Israel was undisturbed for 80 years. As I was thinking about Ehud, and it came about as I was thinking about leadership. You have somebody that took on a role of leadership. Again, there's not really any information as to where he decided to do this, who put him up to it, if he just decided to do this on his own. But he took the opportunity to right a wrong in the nation and to fix a problem that they were having. And as we think about leadership, you have this pattern. Othniel is alive, he's leading, he dies, good leadership goes away, bad leadership takes over, and as that leadership fails, you have people begin to fall back into the idolatry again. Then Ehud comes around, he rights that wrong, he's leading it for 80 years, things are good, then he dies, and it goes back to the same pattern again. And just recognizing how important good leadership is. Not only does a good leader give instructions, like he was proclaiming the truths, but he also was modeling and acting on the things that he was teaching. He was saying, the Lord has given them into your hand, but what does it say? It says that he was in front of them. He was leading the charge, saying, the Lord has given them the hands, let's go. He wasn't the one in the back saying, okay, you do that, that's for you, not for me. He was leading by example and doing it. But one of the things that you can also see from the different judges is that while they were alive, they were holding accountable people. It doesn't necessarily go into specifics on how it happened, but you have to imagine they must have been doing something to keep the nation on the right path throughout the time of their lives. So I guess the takeaway is that if we have the opportunity to be leaders, recognizing that there is a responsibility in that, to keep people moving in the right direction, to be spending time in the Word of God, to be led by God so that we can lead other people. Because while you can see that under good leaders, Ehud was able to do these amazing things, the contrary was also true, that under bad leaders, bad things happened. So leadership matters, and it's not something to just be taken for granted. Now, with that same thing, and I'm not trying to go too far ahead in the book of Judges, but if you kind of look at one of the underlying problems that happens in the book of Judges is that without some sort of central government, you have different tribes living separate from each other, and they are independent. And each one at different times is in varying states of decay, if you will, by idolatry, and the civil thread is unraveling. And without the central leadership, they are unable to work together and hold each other accountable on how they're treating each other, which culminates in what happens to the concubine in the end of Judges. And that is kind of like the whole premise of what happened to her, and then what the guy does afterwards, and the message that he's proclaiming, and then that comes about to, we need a king. But when that comes about in 1 Samuel. But if you remember, God was supposed to be their king, their leader. They were supposed to be looking to him. And it's not that God was failing to lead. They were just failing to follow. And he was allowing them to do that because, I talked about in the beginning of chapter 3, the testing. Will they follow after me or will they not? And clearly, they did not. But it was always God's desire that they would follow after him. And in 1 Samuel 8, God kind of has a lamenting over this. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them that the procedure of the king will reign over them. There was a big warning. And as you know, from being students of the Bible, there was times where, and I'm actually in this right now in my own reading, under certain kings, yes, things were good. But there was also times under certain kings that things were horrible. And some of the darkest times in Israel were under kings. And you read about it in Isaiah and Jeremiah when they were under siege and God was punishing them. They thought that the king was going to be the answer. And God points them back to the answer was, I was supposed to be the answer, and you rejected me. So I guess we'll do it your way again. But warn them, it's going to go the exact same way. It's not going to be good. And the next verse, in chapter 30, verse 31, back in Judges, it says, After him, Shamgar, the son of Anak, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. This is kind of an anomaly of a verse. There's like nothing else to that. I know I read some commentaries, and there's some conjecture that perhaps Shamgar and Samson, same person. I don't know if there's enough to substantiate that or not, but you just have this guy who fights 600 people with an ox goad, which I guess you can't say his feat of valiantry is one to be overlooked. I think fighting a mob of 600 people in of itself would be crazy. But it's just kind of in there. But he was somebody that helped. So, now we're going to move on into chapter 4. And we see in the very first verse, same psalm, different verse. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Wow, that's really new, isn't it? It seems like we keep seeing that recurring theme of good leaders die, and they get right back to doing the things that they shouldn't. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army, Sisera, lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. The next verse, it says, The sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for they had 900 iron chariots, and oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. This is kind of the thing that I was talking about again this morning. We'll kind of go back through it maybe in a little bit more detail. They cried out to the Lord. And again, that idea of the faithfulness of God. God made promises that he would deliver them, that he would give them the land, that they would do all this stuff. You follow after me, I will do this. And if you see, like in that first verse, they again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And in the chapter before that, they again did evil in the sight of the Lord. This constant faithlessness that you see over and over and over again in the nation of Israel. And every time, God continues to be faithful to his promises. And I know I read it in the last meeting as well, but if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. I think that should be one of the greatest encouragements for us in our Christian life, is that we will at times have the ups and downs that you see the nation of Israel have. There is times when we will be living spiritually high, and there are times where sin will bring us low. But just being reminded of the fact that he is faithful, even when we are faithless. And you can look at these failings of this nation constantly, over and over again, these vicious cycles of serving God, serving idols, serving God, serving idols. And the whole time, God is faithful. And the reason, obviously, that he's able to be faithful is because of the complete and finished work of Christ. But to just remember that in our low points, God's not looking at us to be faithful. He's looking at himself to be faithful because he cannot deny his promises. And that is such an encouragement to me. And one of the biggest takeaways I had as I'm reading through this and just seeing these highs and lows. So hopefully that is comforting to you as well. Now, the next verse, it says, Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lepidith, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramoth, Bethel, and the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. There's more about Deborah, I think, in the next chapter. It doesn't really talk a whole lot about who she was or where she came about. But there's a few things that need to be pointed out. One, it's kind of exceptional that you have a woman in a very patriarchally dominant society doing the job that she's doing. But something that I think is of note is she is in one place and her reputation is so great that people are coming to her for judgment. It's not like she's just somebody like she's imposing herself. People are, in a sense, imposing themselves on her by coming and asking her for judgment. They are willing to come all the way to see her and to hear what she had to say. And it's interesting because it doesn't really, there's not a whole lot of detail about who she was, where she came from, how she got in this position, but she was, and she was doing it very well. Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinadab, from Kedesh, Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to Sisera, the commander of David's army, and his chariots and his many troops, to the river Kishron, and I will give him into your hands. When I first read through this first couple times, there's a small detail in there, again, that kind of was about the same, similar to the fords of the river. There's a real small detail that, where does he say he's going to draw him out? He's going to draw him out to a river. And at first, it seems like just an innocuous little detail. But then if you think about chariots, chariots roll on wheels, wheels roll on hard things, rivers would be an incredible tactical disadvantage. So yet again, you can see the wisdom of the Lord in battle here, and where he is going to ordain these things to take place. Because if you can take a chariot, if you kind of look at I don't know exactly how many, it doesn't say how many extra soldiers the enemy had, but they had at least 900 chariots, and he says to bring out 10,000. That's 10 to 1 odds. So if you can slow a chariot down, and honestly, I don't know that much about these chariots, if these are like the chariots that they had in the movie Gladiator with like little whippy things on the side that like cut people down. I have no idea. But we will talk a little bit about chariots coming up here. But chariots were like the cruise missile of their day. They were like the atomic bomb. If you had chariots, you were victorious. And if you could take these chariots and you could use their weakness against them, and they needed to be able to roll, put them in water, and you can slow them down enough for 10 men to be able to attack them, suddenly the odds turn in favor of Israel, which I think is neat how God used that. Their weakness against them, I guess. And he kind of showed them, like, even they have weaknesses. But you have the commander, or what ends up happening later on, is that Sisera is very confident in his technology and in his chariots. And one of the things, I remember reading it through this a long time ago when I was going through Joshua, and it was a passage that kind of was like disturbing to me, partly because we have horses. But this over-reliance on technology is warned against, and he warns Joshua against it. To trust, basically to paraphrase, it's trust God, not horses. In Joshua 11, in verses 4 through 9, it says, They came out, they and all the armies with them, and the many people at the sand that is on the seashore were very many horses and chariots. So all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So you have these big armies that have chariots, and they're coming to fight Israel, this little army of people that are trying to like work their way into the promised land. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. But this is the part where it gets kind of confusing. It says, You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people who were with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Miriam, and they attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel, so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Misrepeth and Maim and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left. And Joshua did as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. So you have them rout the enemy, and when the enemy is gone, their technology remains. But God warns them, it comes up a little bit later in the passage, that he did not want Israel to become so dependent on this new technology that it ended up taking their focus off of the living God who was fighting and delivering the enemy into their hands. And is there times in life where I tend to fall into this category? I forget sometimes that when we get sick, we go to the doctor, forgetting that the doctors know how the world works and they have wisdom because God created it that way. But then also recognizing sometimes God does things miraculously, and sometimes, like we talked about, the fords of the river and fighting with chariots on squishy land, that sometimes God does things the other way and does things just sort of, if you will, by the book in the ways that the world would naturally work. I remember one of the most encouraging things that sticks with me is when Joel, I forget his last name, he talk, we were doing Proverbs, and he's like, Proverbs is just a book about sort of God's order for the universe and the rules and how it's supposed to be played. And when you follow them, things go good, and when you don't, they go bad. But it wasn't that they're even necessarily anything like special. It's just, this is how God worked. When you get really, really sick, sometimes you die, sometimes you get made better by medicine and doctors, and sometimes you get healed miraculously. And God can work in all three of those things. But to not get so hung up on trusting technology is going to get me out of this problem, that we forget that God can also solve the problems directly. And I think that's the lesson that he wanted Israel to learn, in Joshua, why he said hamstring the horses. If you hamstring a horse, I think they can still walk around, they just can't run anymore. And obviously, if you burn a chariot, it's not good for anything except for fire. So it was one of those interesting parallels here, that you have a commander who has chariots, being very dependent on the chariots, and God just kind of laughs at it and says, don't worry about it, we're going to take care of this. We're kind of running short on time, which I'm actually surprised by, because I thought for sure I wasn't going to have enough. But in verse 8, it says, Then Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, Surely I will go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera in the hands of women. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kiddush. I'm going to point this out only because I think there's a certain amount of irony. I would not consider what he said to be particularly bold or brave. He had a command from Deborah that the Lord had given him to say, go do it. And what does he say? I'll only do it if you come with me. And recognizing that Barak is also in the Hall of Faith. He's in chapter 11 of Hebrews. And I think what Deborah says to him, the message that she gives him, is not one that's easily overlooked. She basically said, you're a coward. You're a man, aren't you? Get up and go do what the Lord said. And then she says, but I'll go with you, but the honor's not going to be yours. Like, she kind of chides him for his lack of bravery, in a sense. And yet, he still ends up in the Hall of Faith, which I think is interesting. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. It doesn't really explain why he's in the Hall of Faith, but he's there. Maybe there's something I'm missing that goes on and talks about it more in next week when we go through the Song of Deborah. But I wonder also if perhaps he was doubting Deborah, in that maybe she was just out to get him. So he's like, hey, yeah, go attack the chariots, Barak. It'll be real good for you. He's like, well, if you come with me, now you got some skin in the game. Maybe if you're lying to me, we'll find out. Doesn't say that. Obviously, I'm reading it into there, but I don't understand why, when he had such clear directions, he would not do it. But at the same time, I used to tell people all the time at camp, if everybody did what was easy, rarely would anybody do anything that's right, because the easiest thing is often to just avoid, or the easy things are often not the right things. Like, you can go out of your way to help people, and it's the right thing, but it's easier just to let them be and walk away. But the next verse, it says, let's see. Uh, Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kedesh, and the 10,000 men went with him. Deborah also went with them. Now Heber the Canaanite had separated himself from the Canaanites, from the son-in-law, father-in-law of Moses, and they pitched the tent as far away as the oak at Zenon, which was near Kedesh. They told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinadab, had gone to the Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people were with him, from Heshroth to the river Kishron. Then Deborah said, Barak, arise, for this is the day which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went out from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And it says in the next verse that the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all of his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot, and he fled away on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Haseroth, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not even one was left. Again, you have these sort of atypical historic battle where everybody is routed, everybody is killed. The Lord says, I'm going to give them into your hands. He's not going to give most of them, he's going to give all of them. And that's exactly what happens. And here, I know we pointed this out in the last one, but it's that over-reliance on technology. I'm sure Sisera thought this was going to be a piece of cake. We're just going to ride out there, we're going to destroy Israel, it's all going to be good, everything's going to go well. And he was so dependent on his technology, he overlooked the fact that the Israelites were served a living God, and perhaps he forgot history in seeing them defeat enemies just like this in the past, and ended up falling trap to that over-reliance on technology and overlooking the simple fact that maybe my chariots aren't going to roll so good on squishy ground. And obviously that was used against him, and he lost. But instead of staying and dying with his men, he flees. Now, this passage, we don't have a whole lot of time to go into it, but there's a few things that are really worth pointing out. For the sake of time, I won't read the next part of it, but I'll paraphrase it. You see him running. He goes to the house of Heber, where Jael is. Heber's wife, Jael, is. And she tells him, come in here, come in here, come in here. And then she gets hidden, and then goes in there, and then the 10 pegs to the temple thing happens. What we read, or we might fail to miss, and I honestly missed this as well, but if you look back through Americans and people in the Near East, even to this day, have a different view of hospitality. Like, hospitality was offering not only like meals and lodging, it was safety, and it was something that you did not violate. It was like an unwritten code. And it was important because at the time, if you think about like how trade happens, if you had people that were traveling and then they were accosted on the trade routes, they would just not come to your place and trade. There was like a social fabric part of it that went into good economy, not only being neighborly, but it was this ethical code that was not violated. And here you have Jael, whose husband politically seems to, at least it kind of alludes to it, would have been more politically aligned with Sisera. They were at peace, and she has the general of the army of the king, who her husband is at peace with, come into her house, which you would expect. And for her to give quarter to him would be expected. But some of the other times we see people coming and offering hospitality, like think about Lot, right? Another gross story in the Old Testament, when the angels come to Lot and he takes them in and the people are banging on the door, and the thing that he offers up, like, here, take my daughters instead, like, that's like unthinkable. But that is the level that people took hospitality to heart in the culture where this stuff was going on. And I'm going to read a note out of my study Bible that I think kind of drives home the point, and I think is worth reading. And they pointed out, because again, you wouldn't necessarily think of it. It says, in her actions, Jael violates a series of fundamental social norms. In offering hospitality to Sisera, she usurps her husband's exclusive right as a male to offer hospitality to a male. So she should not have been doing this in the first place. In killing Sisera, she violates the covenant between Heber and Sisera's superior. So she brings him in, and then they were supposed to be at peace, and she violates that. And beyond that, in killing Sisera, she also who had sought hospitality and protection in her house, she violates the fundamental rights of a guest. As in the Middle East today, in the ancient Near East, hospitality towards strangers represented one of the highest social values, even superseding a man's responsibility of well-being for his children, which you see in chapter 19. But this is the part that he points out that I think is so poignant. He says, the story of jail in these verses represents one of the most blatant violations of this value in the literature of the ancient world. Nonetheless, God uses his actions to accomplish his objective. Like, what she did is so outside of the norm that in all the literature, like secular literature and like accounts that happened in this time period in history, like, it stands out that it was bizarre. It never really talks about what her motive was or why she did it. Again, as I mentioned before, she should have been this man's friend, and they should have been political allies, and yet she decided to do this thing, which ultimately worked out for the better of securing God's plan of giving Sisera and ultimately the king into the hands of Israel. Because we're getting a little short on time, I guess I'll end it there as far as talking about that. But whatever her motivations were, why it happened, all that stuff, this still goes down to me as probably like one of the top 5 strangest stories in the entire Bible. It's just it is a really, really bizarre story. And I guess it's worth recognizing that it's bizarre also goes to the point of, like, this just doesn't seem like something you do to your guests, which makes it even, I guess, in some ways even more bizarre. But anyways, so just some concluding thoughts. I know I used it in the introduction last week, but doing things over and over again, expecting a different result. Time and time again, God said, follow after me, serve me, things will go well. Don't, things will go poorly. And time again, the nation of Israel serves idols. Things go poorly. Time and again, the faithfulness of God comes forth, and when they call out and they cry out to him, he answers and he delivers them. So as we think about, again, I'm going to kind of reuse the same thought as last week. When we think about their failures and their inability to do what is right, if we're honest with ourselves, we can see that in the experiences of our own lives. And I guess, hopefully, when we are in those low points and we see ourselves in failing and we come to recognize those things as the Spirit works in our lives, that we would be able to stop, repent, and rejoice in the faithfulness of God in the same way they were able to rejoice for those 80 years, 18 years, 40 years that we've covered in the last 2 or 3 chapters, where when they were doing what they should be and God was blessing them as he wished to do, again, showing forth his faithfulness. So I'm so glad that we serve a God that is faithful. I'm thankful that even through these bizarre, gruesome stories, we can see the faithfulness of God come out over and over and over again. Even though Judges is kind of hard to go through, and I don't think I'd want to teach it to Sunday school kids, because how do you explain that story of jail to kids? I don't know. It just seems like it'd be difficult. But praise the Lord that we serve a faithful God. And I guess with that, I'll close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunities to study your word and to not overlook perhaps the less glamorous, the more gruesome and challenging chapters, Lord, to see your faithfulness, your desire to deliver on the promises that you gave, and also your willingness to punish failures. We thank you, Lord, that as we think about the punishment for sin, we think about the victories that you gave the nation of Israel, we can see that you gave us total victory by simple faith in your Son, Jesus Christ, that we have no fear of death because of what he did, and his work was completely and totally finished, and that we can celebrate that, and that we can be grateful and thankful and remembering of your faithfulness to us when we follow in like patterns of Israel and we fall down and we follow after other things. We thank you for your faithfulness.